What's up, YouTube friends? So I have not done a table topper or table runner for quite some time. I got this jelly roll at Tuesday mornings before they closed up here in Omaha. And today I'm going to show you how to make an easy table runner using 2.5-inch strips. So the things you're going to need to make this is, of course, a jelly roll. You're also going to need some batting. About 1.25 yards will be fine, especially if you want to quilt this. And also 1.25 yards of backing. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to use for the backing yet, but we'll find out by the end of this video. I'll also be using my sewing machine with matching thread, my iron and ironing board, and then just the basics like my rotary cutter, a ruler, and some pins. So let's get started. Now, as I said earlier, I got this jelly roll from Tuesday mornings before they closed up here in Omaha, so it was on sale. Now, one of my favorite things to do is open up these jelly rolls because you really get a good sense of all your fabrics and colors. So I do believe the pattern I'm going for is called fences and rails, just on a smaller scale. So the first thing you're going to want to do is grab 3 strips from your jelly roll. Now I like to get a nice selection of colors, so I'm going to take this pretty purple. I really like this white one, or light colored one I should say. And I'm going to just do this bright yellow. So now I just want to pick out 3 more different colors. So I'm going to choose this one, this stripe, and this pink polka dot. And then for the final strips, I'm going to pick out this one, and this one, and that's all the colors of this jelly roll. So these are going to be my strip sets that I'm going to sew together. So next I'm just going to take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to open this up. Then I'm going to take the yellow one with my right sides together. And with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to sew all the way down, backstitching at the beginning and the end. So today I'll be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch, and my length is a 2.5. I actually have that on a zigzag, so I need to switch this. And I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and just keep sewing. So I'm coming up to my end, and don't forget to backstitch. And if you can see here, this bottom strip was a little longer, but that's just fine. We'll just trim that off later. So next I'm just going to open up my strip set. You could iron this if you want to, but I'll iron it after I get the 3rd piece on. I'm going to take my 3rd piece. I'm going to open it up, right sides together. And with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew all the way down, backstitching at the beginning and the end. And I'm going to continue to do that till I have 3 different strip sets. So now I'm just going to press these flat. So what I like to do is just start from the back. So I'm just going to go down the middle strip with my iron. So I'm going to press my seams outwards. And then I'm going to flip this around and I'm going to iron it from the front. And just to make sure everything's laying nice and flat and that there aren't any creases. So now we're just going to cut this into blocks. Now we should end up with a 6.5 inch width strip. So I'm just going to measure it here. And that's what I have. So I'm just going to take a little bit off the end because of my salvage. So I just went ahead and I lined it up on my grid. And I should get about 5 blocks per strip. Now you're only going to need 12 for our table runner. I want this to be about 12 inches wide by 36 inches long. So if you need it longer, you just need more blocks. Alright guys, apparently I can't do math because I actually got 6 blocks per strip. And then I have about this much left over. So that'll just go into my scrap bin. Now for these last 2 strips, I'm just going to go ahead and save a little time, and I just have them stacked on top of each other. Sometimes you can get a wonky cut if you do it that way, so just be careful. So now you just want to lay out your table runner. So for this fences and rails design, I'm going to put 1 block going horizontal, and then the one next to it, I'm going to put vertical. Just like that. As I mentioned, this is going to be 12 inches by 36 roughly. So for this row down here at the bottom, I'm going to do opposite of the horizontal. So I'll have the vertical one right down here. And then the one next to that will be horizontal. And now I want to mix these up as best as I can. I'm going to try my hardest not to get any of my colors touching like this. So I'll get this laid out and I'll show you what I get. Alright, so this looks good to me. There are a few spots, like these ones will be touching corner to corner. Same thing right here. But as long as they're not touching like this, I'm okay with that. And I do have 6 extra blocks left over, so if you want this to go wider, you can definitely go wider with just those 3 strip sets. Another thing you could do is just make little mug rugs out of your extra blocks to match your table topper. That will be a great gift. So now we just want to sew this together, and there's a couple different ways that you could do that. You could sew them into blocks. So I would just go ahead and sew these 2 together, and then sew these 2 together. You'd want to press your seams to opposite sides, and then I would go ahead and then just match up my center seam and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you want to do that until you have 3 blocks. You could go ahead and just sew them into 2 different strips. So I'd start here with the top, face them right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, open it up, and then grab your next piece. And that's actually what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take my first block and my second block. I'm going to lay it so the right sides are together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So right down this edge, back stitching at the beginning and the end. So I'll be using that same straight stitch and the same 2.5 stitch length. And I'll back stitch. And then sew all the way down. And then I'll just grab my next piece, put them right sides together, and do the same thing until I have 2 strips. So I have both of my strips sewed together, and I pressed my seams. For this bottom one, I pressed my seams going to the right, and then I pressed my seams for the top one to the left, and that's going to make sure that our corners nestle up nicely. So I'm just going to take the top one, lay it over the bottom one, and you really want to make sure that your corners match up nicely. You don't really need to worry about if there's any extra at the beginning and the end because we can trim that. We just want to make sure that our corners match up perfectly. So I'm just going to stick a pin. And I'm actually going to stick a pin in every single intersection. Alright, now you might have a section like this one right here where it looks like there's a little more fabric at the top than at the bottom, but that's fine. Once we get to sew this together, it will work itself out. If it's a lot of fabric, you could also just give your fabric a little tug when you're sewing it, and that'll flatten right out. So now I'm just going to take this over to my sewing machine, and with that same 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning, sew all the way down, and backstitch at the end. Alright guys, so same 1/4 inch seam allowance, same straight stitch. And also if you have that issue with there might be a little bit more fabric at the top or the bottom, if possible, you want to put that side down. The feed dogs will pull that bottom fabric a little bit faster than the top, and it also works itself out. And I also like to keep my pin in there until the last possible moment. Sometimes if you do remove your pin, your fabric will shift and you won't get those perfect corners. And sometimes I actually just sew over my pins. Don't tell the Karens. And now just give it a good press. Alright, so I was going to use a pillowcase, but the one problem I had with that was that there was a seam at the bottom and I didn't want a seam at the middle of my table runner. So then I dug through my extra scrap fabric bin and I found this old cut up sheet. I think my friend Rama gave me this, but I'm not quite sure. It could have been a subscriber. And I think this matches perfectly with the colors on our table runner. So that was a great find that I forgot I had. It's always a good thing to go through your stash once in a while. And then I was going to use regular batting, but I found a scrap of flannel. Now I always like to use flannel for the batting. I think it lays a lot flatter. If you like that poofy look, go ahead and use cotton batting or even polyester. But a lot of the times, Mother likes to set her beer can half on the table runner of the fluffier kind, and then it spills. And somehow, that's my fault. So now we're just going to sandwich these together, and then we're going to quilt this. So I'm just going to cut a piece off of this sheet here. Now I actually have enough that I can make about 3 or if not 4 more of these table runners, so that's perfect. I'm just going to kind of eyeball what I need and then cut it off. If you're going to use yardage, you want about 1.25 yards for the backing as well as the batting. That's going to give you some wiggle room when we go to quilt this together. So now I'm just going to take this over to the iron board. I'm going to make sure any of these creases are ironed out. Everything's laying nice and flat on the backing as well as my batting. So now I'm just going to lay my backing piece with the right side facing down. And then I'm going to lay my flannel piece on top. Make sure everything is smooth, nice and flat. And then I'm going to grab my table topper or runner. And make sure that is smooth, nice and flat. So the next step we're going to do is pin this together and quilt it to your desired pattern. Now because I found this flannel, I'm going to go ahead and just take my ruler and I'm going to start in the center. I have a friction pin here. This is like a regular pin, however it does disappear with a hot iron or if you wash it. So I'm just going to go from corner to corner in each of my block and sew a diagonal line. When I go to quilt this together, I like to start in the center and work my way out. That way if any of the fabric shifts, which it really shouldn't if you pin it well enough, that any of the puckers or the wrinkles will just get worked out as we work our way out to the sides. Now if you are using batting instead of this flannel, you're going to want to check your batting packaging, and that's going to tell you how close your stitches need to be. I really don't have a problem with batting shifting on table runners or table toppers, but when you get to doing quilts, then it definitely does matter. But like I said, I'm just going to do this easy, quick diagonal pattern. If you don't have a friction pin, you could always just use chalk. That works fine. Or you can try to eyeball it. I'm never really good at eyeballing straight lines this long though. So I have it all marked out. Now this is going to go pretty easily. Quilting does take a long time and it's kind of boring. That's why I'm just going to do these few lines. You could also come back and do a crosshatch design if you want to. Or you could just keep it easy and just stitch in the ditch down the middle and then each of the intersections to our block. That should be fine also. So now I'm just going to pin this together quite heavily through all 3 layers. And I'm just going to avoid my pin marks. Now that I have everything nice and pinned, I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to quilt down my lines. Now there's really no need to backstitch at the beginning or the end. However, you do want to start and stop off of your project. Alright, so I'm actually going to start in the middle of my table runner. And I'm just going to line up my line with the center of my presser foot. And with my hands, I'm going to make sure everything is laying nice and flat. And one more thing before I get sewing. This is pretty thin, so I'm not going to do it now. But if you are using any sort of thicker batting, you're going to want to bump up your stitch length to about a 3, even a 3.5 if it's really thick. But this is pretty thin. So now I'm just going to continue to do that to the right, and then I'll flip it over and then finish the left side. So now that I have all the quilting that I'm going to do done, you just want to give everything a nice press, and I just zoomed you in here to see how this pin line will just disappear with my hot iron. Just like that. So now we just want to trim our edges. So I'm just going to line up one of the lines on my ruler with our center seam. And then just hack off the extra. And I like to start on my ends first. So I'm just going to flip it around and do the same thing. So now I'm just going to line up my edges and then just hack off the top and the bottom. And now we need to do a binding. Now you could go ahead and just take a few strips from your jelly roll if you don't plan on making any more tops and make a nice scrappy binding. But I'm actually going to do a black binding. I really like to use a black binding on my quilts as well as my table runners and table toppers because I just think it frames it out nicely. So I'm going to cut about 3 strips. I think 2 will be plenty, but it's always nice to have a little extra. But I'm going to cut it 2.5 inches wide by the width on the bolt. Alright guys, so actually I could not find my yardage, my plain yardage, but I did have this black backing fabric, so it's about 108 inches wide, so I only need 1 piece. Now if you are just going to use regular cotton yardage, to join these pieces together, what I would do is I would lay them so that the right sides are touching, and I'd actually put them just like this. Then I would take it over to my sewing machine and I will go ahead and I'll sew corner to corner, just like that. Then you're just going to want to clip off any of this extra fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that way when you go to open this up, it will look something like that. And you won't have a big bulky knot here when you go to sew it together. It kind of spreads out that seam allowance. I'll link a couple quilt videos at the end of this video that'll go into better detail on how I attach my binding strips together. So now you're just going to want to fold this in half with the wrong sides together, just like that. And I'm going to give this a press the whole length of my strip. So now I'm going to turn my table topper to the back. I always like to start on the back when I'm attaching my binding, but you can do it any way that you want. So I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm going to line up the raw edges of my strip with the raw edges of my table runner. And then I'm going to stick a pin, and I'm going to leave about 8-inch tail. Next I'm going to measure over about 10 to 12 inches. And I'm going to stick another pin. And actually I'm going to move this one down a couple just to make sure it's more in the center. So here's my starting, and I have about a 12-inch gap right here. Now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to start at this pin, and I'm going to sew on my binding. When I get to my corner, I'm going to stop about a 1/4 inch away from the end. I'm going to raise my presser foot with my needle down, and I'm going to spin, and I'm going to sew right off my corner, just like that. So I'm just going to stick a pin here just for demonstration purposes. So then I'm going to break my thread. I'm going to lay my strip over just like that at a 45-degree angle, and then bring it forward again so that my crease lines up with the edge. And then I'm just going to continue with my 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Then when I get to my final pin, I'll backstitch and I'll show you what to do next. Alright guys, so my first pin was right there. I just took it out. So I'm going to backstitch, and I'm going to do it about 2 or 3 times. And then with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just sew till I get to my corner. So when I get about a 1/4 inch away, I'm going to stop with my needle down, raise my presser foot and spin, and then sew right off that corner. Ignore that chalk mark, but just like that. So now I'm just going to open it up to make that 45-degree angle. This is kind of hard to do on the sewing machine. And then I'm just going to lay it flat. Just like that, matching up my fold with this edge. And you should have this little triangle fold. So now I'm just going to continue down with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, so I'm coming up to my final pin, so don't forget to backstitch. Alright, so here is what it should look like. So actually I'm going to just clip off the salvage end right here. Try to do a straight cut. I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to overlap that by 2.5 inches, which is right here, and clip it off. Now I actually should have left a little bit more. Your cut should be somewhere down here. It'll just make it a lot easier to sew together. I'm just going to open this one up so that I have a little peak facing up. And then I'm going to go ahead and open this one up, and I'm going to put it face down. Just like that. And I'm matching up this raw edge with this raw edge. And because I like to make things difficult for myself, I'm actually going to throw a couple pins in here just to make sure nothing moves on me. And then I'm just going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to just sew corner to corner right along here. And you want to make sure that you have this little triangle piece, and this is what you'll be cutting off. See you at the sewing machine. Alright guys, so this time I am going to backstitch also. And remove my pin. And just keep sewing. Alright guys, so it should look like that. And it's always a good idea to make sure that you did it the right way. This time I did. Before you go ahead and cut off your little dog ear. So now I'm just going to clip this off, and I'm going to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now when we go to lay that flat, we have a perfect amount to finish our little gap. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end. And I'm going to sew with that 1/4 inch seam allowance just to close our little opening. So now I'm just going to take my iron, and I just like to press my binding out. So now I'm just going to flip this around, and our final step is I'm going to fold this over, and I like to go just past our seam line. And I always like to use a zigzag. I think it always covers the front and the back nicely. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and with a zigzag stitch I'm going to sew down my binding. When I get to my corner, I'm going to go ahead and lay this off flat just like that. So it kind of looks like a little triangle. And then I'm going to bring this edge over. And you'll have a nice, pretty mitered corner. And then all you have to do is turn around this corner and just keep sewing. And I'll show that more at the sewing machine. Alright, so I changed my stitch to a zigzag stitch. My length is still a 2.5 and my width is a 3. Now when I zigzag, I'm going to zig onto my binding, and when I zag, I'm just going to come right off or right to the edge, as much as possible anyway. And like I said, I just have my binding right over that stitch mark. So I'm going to backstitch in the beginning, and then just sew. Alright, so I'm coming up to my corner, so I'm actually going to start with the bottom side first. And you just want to lay that nice and flat, so it makes a little triangle over on this side. And then I'm going to fold this edge over. And that way when you go around the corner, you're not going to get caught on this little fold. So I'm going to sew up until my corner. I'm going to stop with my needle down, raise my presser foot, and spin. And then just sew. Alright, so here is what it looks like on our kitchen table, and I think it turned out great. Like I said, the black border really makes everything pop, and it just brings it all together, like a piece of art. Now here's the front, of course. And if Mother wanted to, she could flip it to the back, and it's equally as great. So I hope you give this fast and easy table runner a try. If you like this video and want to see more of my videos, go down below and hit that big red subscribe button, and give this video a big thumbs up. If you have a question about this video or any of my other videos, or would just like to leave a suggestion for a future upcoming video, leave me a comment. If you'd like to support this channel, I'll leave my Etsy link down below, and you can see what I'm making and selling over there. I'll also link my social medias if you'd like to follow me on them. And as always, thanks for watching, happy sewing, and I'll see you next time.